Welcome back. If you just joined us, you are watching KTN Prime. In tonight's discussion, we're looking at the 2025-2026 budget, the gains and the losses. We set the stage for what we are discussing tonight in the first half and then in the second half. Alexander, let's look at how the government has fared in the current financial year. The budget that was allocated in this financial year that we are currently in. How can you rate the government in its spending in the areas of success and failure, if you can? Mm-hmm. I know it's probably a wide discussion, but just give us a nutshell.
It's a wide area, but it's important, first of all, to go back to how the budget was, the current budget that we are implementing was appropriated. It was appropriated at the total budget was 4.29 trillion. And it had a budget deficit, or meaning what we had not funded, of around 923 billion. However, we have seen in the supplementary one budget, the deficit has increased to around 1,140 billion, meaning we are going to borrow more in this financial year for us to fund the operations of government this year. This is now proceeding into the budget policy statement, because now we are again proposing to borrow around 1,115 billion in the coming year. What is more worrying for Kenyans is the fact that our domestic borrowing has increased, and we are now targeting to borrow 890 billion Kenya shillings in the coming year. Basically, 80% of our borrowing in the next financial year, as per the BPS, will come from the domestic market. This has a direct impact on our businesses, because it means then government is borrowing more in the domestic market, which means a business person who goes to the market to borrow will be competing with government. So what this ends up happening is there is an economic aspect where we say there is a crowding out effect, where the banks will not be willing to fund small businesses or individuals because government is coming in a big way. So what now we are seeing in the supplementary, even though our revenues are not performing as well, because I think as of December, we had a shortfall of about 136 billion of what we had targeted to raise, but the supplementary budget is increasing expenditure by 260 billion. I think 262 billion. So essentially it means that most of the money is going to be borrowed again. So what we ask ourselves is, did things go wrong during implementation, or did they start going wrong at development or at preparation of the budget? In my view, things start going wrong at preparation of the budget. And that is why the discussion we are having tonight is relevant, because when I look at now the targeted revenue of about ordinary revenue from taxes of 2.9 trillion. That means if this year we had targeted to raise 2.7 trillion, and in the next financial year we are targeting to raise 2.9 trillion, of which even the 2.7 we are seeing shortfalls, it means either government is planning to be either more efficient in terms of how we collect our revenues, or we anticipate a situation where we are going to raise taxes for us to raise more. But now,
would you say that the projections are too ambitious? Because it sounds like that's what you're saying.
They are too optimistic, in my view. Even the BPS itself, when it comes to projecting the GDP growth, which is now the growth we expect in the next financial year, it is using two different growth terminologies for different purposes. When we are looking at growth between this year and next year, we are using what we call real GDP. But when we want to compute the revenue, we are using nominal GDP. In the same document, you have 5.3% growth when we are looking at the growth between this year and next year. But when we go into now computing the revenue, we are using nominal GDP at 10.2%. In my view, achieving a growth of that nature is not practical. From our own estimates, if we do very well in terms of our ordinary revenue, that is from our taxes, we cannot go anywhere past 2.7 trillion.
Let's hear from you, Johnson. Seems like you have something to say.
No, I was just amused when you were talking about the focus for budget deficits. But in the budget policy statement, that they say in broad terms that they are going to pursue prudent fiscal strategy, and they are going to pursue fiscal consolidation. Now, obviously, the qualification is that they are going to anchor it on increased revenue growth. They don't talk about consolidation, fiscal consolidation, and paring back on the spending. And of course, that is rather obvious because you're seeing the spending projections is upwards, it's not downwards. So they're not looking at cutting spending. They're not looking at, well, they'll tell you that they're trying to be more efficient and everything in their spending, and they'll try to be more transparent and all the nice words that you can throw at it. But the truth of the matter is, if they are planning to increase spending, they're not planning to become more efficient. It's that simple. Because if you are increasing spending and you're not efficient, if your current spending you're not efficient, then if you're increasing spending, it means that you have embraced your inefficiencies.
We'll come back to domestic borrowing, and I like what Alexander mentioned. Brings me to this question. This year, the target was to borrow about 5.2%, as you've mentioned, Alexander, of the GDP as our deficit. And there's been a feeling that we are likely to do a higher percentage, given the expenditure we are currently facing. What do you think? Is that the case, Johnson?
Well, you know, the song "Follow the Leader." State House, you can look at State House spending. I mean, that's generally how the government is going to operate. Now, they're going to spend that way, and they're going to try and look for all manners and methods of justifying their spending. Oh, it will bring improved economic growth. Oh, it will bring efficiency. Oh, we are trying to create jobs. But it's all bunk. The truth of the matter is they're addicted to spending. They want to, be visible in how they are, trying to improve the Kenyan's life, and they don't really care about the deficit. It's actually a boon to them that the global economy right now, the global financial dynamics right now is such that if you've been following, say, for example, the dollar, there's a lot more of it. It's losing value, so it's actually giving government a lot of relief, and you can see it even growing the dollar reserves. But at some point, the bill will come due. We've got that breathing space from the global economy. Of course, they want to take credit for that, but the truth of the matter is we're not using this opportunity to improve our fiscal position. Right now it's spend because elections are around the corner. But and when you asked Alex whether how do you score the government, the primary measure is the citizen better off as a consequence of this budget and of the last 4 years of economic policy. I mean, 1 year won't make a difference. The 1 year that's left won't really make a difference. So if you're looking to score, are you better off? Is the economic theories that they're employing working? Those are, I think, the questions that we should be looking at.
I know there's a very big question on job creation because there's so many youth in this country who do not have jobs. And I know you've mentioned, Alexander, that if things do not turn out the way the projections are looking, and you say the projections are, well, in your view, they're ambitious. And that means perhaps that there will be a resort to domestic borrowing. And just to mention a few, figures here, the budget deficit is increasing from 901 billion now to 1 trillion shillings in the coming financial year. And you mentioned that, Alexander, making the threshold of one of its kind, actually. And of course, not forgetting the Treasury CS is proposing to finance this deficit with external borrowing of less than 100 billion and domestic borrowing of 1.1 trillion.
And tax reforms so that you can pay more.
Johnson, what impact do you think this is likely to have on the local economy?
No, it's just loss of competitiveness. It's that simple. It always comes down to loss of competitiveness. If you are looking at, when you're talking about you're facing a high cost of doing business, how will additional government spending impact your trading environment? Of course, it will raise your cost of doing business that much more. And they want to, and they have said it, they want to collect more tax revenues. From where? It's from the businesses. Because it's still the businesses that pay salaries, it's the businesses that, so that's where the impact will largely be. What does that mean for investors? Is it an investor-friendly environment? Some of us invest because we must invest, because we are looking at tomorrow. But the people who don't have to invest here, then they'll look for alternatives, and that's where the problem is. You're losing investors at the margin, and you need your investors, you need your entrepreneurs to be able to come together to pursue opportunities to create jobs. But if your cost of doing business is high and going higher, then it means the opportunities that were opportunities when the tax rate was a little lower cease to be opportunities when you raise the tax rates.
We'll come back to that, especially on the MSMEs. Dismas, let's talk about government spending. There's been a big conversation about State House, and I think that's one of the things you've mentioned, some of the areas of wastage. What are the areas you would say, Dismas, that you may analyze as areas of wastage? I know there's been questions about State House, questions about the education capitation dwindling, and yet a lot of money was given into this particular sector. What do you make of where we are in this financial year in terms of government spending, Dismas?
Well, you see, the purpose of a budget, and in the Kenyan context, number one, it must be anchored in equity and equality. That is why you hear some people complaining that the administration is spending so much on roads or even on putting up stadia, because there are some people in Kenya who have not traveled out of Nairobi or Mount Kenya, and they don't know that in other parts of Kenya, when people see a tarmac road, they break into a dance and song. So that if the government is going to spend more resources on roads, anchored in the concept of equity and equality, outside just those job opportunities, you are opening up new markets. There are also people are talking about stadia, that why should you be putting up a stadium? I'm not much of a man when it comes to sports, but I understand in UK, soccer is a big deal. So if you're putting up facilities to encourage talent in soccer, so that soccer becomes a big deal in Kenya, I don't understand why people are complaining. Now, in the budget-making process, there is public participation, obviously, and the Speaker of the National Assembly has paid specific attention to Articles 221 and 201. Mr. Moses Wetangula has ensured that those relevant committees actually go out and speak to people, and created the opportunity for people to present their views. Now, the second question is, when Kenyans present their views, is this actually a ceremonial process, or members of the various committees actually pay attention to that? Now, if they pay attention to that, then you're going to weed out a lot of this wastage. Because, some of the headlines you see in the newspapers would make a rational man get into a state of shock. That we're investing a lot of resources on air travel. A lot of resources on air travel. Sometimes you understand when politicians are going to launch a project, the project may be valued at, say, 1 million Kenyan shillings. And then they spend 10 million to launch the project. I mean, have you not seen a very high concentration of helicopters, high concentration of SUVs going to launch a well, going to launch a cattle dip? Of course, the example I'm giving is very extreme, but that one does not reflect efficiency and effectiveness. You recall at some stage, when he was Minister for Finance, then President Kenyatta said, we are going to do with these top-of-the-range SUVs, and we are going to go on with smaller cars. I wonder whether we still have that policy in place. When the administration tells Kenyans that we want you to tighten your belts, but when you look at the leaders, they don't lead by example. They're not tightening their belts. So the ordinary taxpayer sits back and begins to wonder and ask critical questions. Is this public participation really ceremonial, or do members of the National Assembly or Senate or elected leaders pay attention? Now, there are a number of elected leaders who have done very well when it comes to the budget-making process. I mean, if you go to Murang'a, Governor Irungu Kang'ata does very well. For instance, he has set aside 160 million to pay for medical insurance for persons with pecuniary challenges. That is something that deserves a pat on the back. He has automated his own source revenue to to 1.2 billion from, I think, 0.5 billion when he took over. Those are the positive impacts of a budget statement, that you are actually addressing the needs, interests, and aspirations of wananchi. But if you use the budget statement to make selected political leaders rich, or you use the budget process to serve cartel interest or special interest, then people will begin yawning and asking very deep questions, which is the reason why we expect that all members of the National Assembly, all members of the county assemblies interact with Auditor General's reports.
Let's hear from
or the control of budget reports.
I want to hear from Alexander. We do hear what Dismas is saying, and of course, very strong reflections there on how the government is conducting itself in making sure that it speaks into the issues really that are at the heart of what is ailing the economy, and of course what Kenyans are really not happy about. In your view, Alexander, what are the key areas where you would say the government has not been able to do very exemplary as we look at the current financial year?
Okay, thank you. When you look at even this January, we've had serious challenges in the area of education. And all of us saw when we had grade 10s joining school, and we had, I think, was it a good number, I can't remember, but it was in their thousands of students who could not join grade 10. And eventually they were rounded up and told to go to school, whether with school fees or not. So that's an area that we would say is not doing very well. And when we look at even our debt levels currently, when this administration came in, if you recall, one of the things they promised is that they're going to reduce on debt accumulation. However, the reverse has been true. We have seen debt increasing at alarming rates. When they came in, there was also a promise that we are going to do fiscal consolidation. If you recall, the first few meetings, actually their first supplementary budget, they said we are going to start with this budget and we are going to cut spending by 300 billion. So what was expected then was that we are going to reduce our deficit. Basically, fiscal consolidation means we are going to reduce our borrowing and cut our cloth according to our size. But when you look at the statistics, and they are very well presented in the BPS, we have moved our fiscal deficit from 5.8 in financial year 23-24. 24-25, it went to 6.1. In the current fiscal year, we had projected to have a fiscal deficit of 4.9, but now the projection is, looking at now the increased level of borrowing, we are going to find ourselves getting to 6.2. So if you look at the trajectory, instead of reducing our fiscal deficit towards 3, because that was the target, now it is now heading to 6.2. And looking at this budget policy statement, if we continue, or if Parliament approves this budget in the way it is, by the time we come to the closure of this financial year in July of next year, I hope God keeps us, it will be beyond 6.2%.
But I hear from you, Alexander, is that over the years we have been revising our revenue targets
Yes.
downwards, but yet revising our expenditure figures upwards. What do you project for, if this really remains the case, Johnson, what might happen to this country in the coming months or year?
I think those in government right now, they're praying very hard that monetary policy in the US is sustained or even worsened, because it gives them a lot of ability to borrow and do a lot of financial engineering to help them, get through to the end of their relative terms, right, or the relevant terms. So that's what we are looking at. Usually, and this is usually the process. If you hold everything constant, if you keep spending in this manner, of course, when you spend, the first fallback is taxes. And if taxes run out, you borrow. When your borrowing runs out, now you start an expansionary monetary policy, and that's where the friction now comes. And if central bank holds firm, then you talk about high interest rates like we had 2-3 years ago. And if they don't, now you're talking about inflation now. And then at some point, it just all falls apart. Obviously, sometimes this takes years, or it can take decades to evolve, because if you look at our recent history, and in my view, the mistakes we started making say in Jubilee 1, right? Jubilee 1, Jubilee 2. So we are paying for maybe mistakes in Jubilee 2 right now because of reinforcing Jubilee 1. And it's just simple things. Like Dismas talked about stadia, right? Now, does it make sense to do a stadia with 44B, even assuming no interest cost or whatever? But if you look at the value creation with that 44, how much can you really expect? Does it pay for itself? Those revenues that are using to pay for that could have gone somewhere else and been used for something else.
Johnson, I just wonder, where does the wastage go? The money that you're saying is definitely not reflected, because as you say, 44 billion, for instance, it doesn't make sense for a stadia. And as you rightfully mentioned, how is a stadia able to manage its own
it will have its own operating costs
and getting back the money that has been spent.
And then finance costs. And you
Where
can
do you think the wastage is going?
And it's part of that is there. Like for example, even SGR, right? When they were starting SGR, we were talking about the alternative was upgrading MGR at 60 billion, right? The year around the time when that discussion was going on, revenues were around 50 billion for Kenya Railways, right? So 50 billion revenues make sense to invest 60 billion. But these guys come and tell us, no. Let's do this SGR. It will cost about 300 billion for a business that generates 30 billion, 50 billion.
What do you make of the idea of...
Now I'm getting there. Mm-hmm. So now, SGR, as we're speaking today, has a revenue of 20 billion, right? The cost to bring it up to where it was right now is about 600 billion, if you're being conservative. 600 billion. You're not counting the... So now, interest comes in. The revenue is not even enough to cover the interest. You still have operating costs to run. So now we have to go back to our pockets to keep funding this thing. This thing costs us more than it's generating in value. It's not even a question. So such things are not...
Actually, talking about SGR...
I just want to hear about, as we come to a close, I know we've run out of time, but there's the conversation on the government looking at further Eurobond deals to manage debt maturities. What do you feel about this particular idea?
Financial engineering. That's what that is. You're restructuring debt. You're taking maturities longer. So yes, it lowers it improves your cash flows for now, but your debt has not come down. In fact, it's going to go up. But there's a point it comes that even we see it in businesses and we've seen it in governments. There's a point it becomes a point of no return. And then now, when things start going haywire, and you've got a balance sheet a debt stock of higher than your GDP, it becomes problematic.
Alexander, if we have more SMEs closing, because you talked about domestic borrowing being perhaps an alternative that the government will resort to, what does that project for the country? Because businesses have actually been closing in this country, and if MSMEs are affected to this degree, what are we seeing as the future of this country? Because the MSMEs provide, majority of the jobs in this country.
So when MSMEs are suffering because they cannot access credit, although we can give credit to the fact that credit to private sector has grown. I think now we are at 5.5% growth compared to a negative 1.4 in January of last year. But we've seen more and more businesses not being in a position to repay their debt obligations. So what is going to happen is we are going to lose jobs. We are going to see more auctions. I think the last 2 to 3 years, you've seen in our papers, the number of pages of items being auctioned is increasing by the day. So this tells you that businesses are now doing very well, and therefore jobs will be lost and actually continue to get lost. And if you talk to those in business, we are not doing well at all. And this is affecting every household today, because when you lose a job, it means that is a livelihood that has been threatened.
Your final remarks, gentlemen, as we come to a close. I'm just going to give you 15 seconds. Let's begin with you, Dismas.
Yeah, there's a point raised here about the SGR. That is why it's very important to immunize the budget-making process from special interest groups or cartels. I remember at a news conference, then President Kenyatta said he was going to make public the SGR contracts. You know, that is part of public participation, but nobody has ever made it public so that Kenyans know exactly what was contained therein. Even the Eurobond we are talking about, you remember again the Auditor General, then Mr. Oko, wanted to go and satisfy himself that everything is okay. And then President Kenyatta said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? It means that we don't even respect our governance institutions. And talking about these policy reviews, you recall again, Musalia Mudavadi said that when they took over as Kenya Kwanza, the first thing they needed to do was to clean tables, policy reviews and adjustments, and they said it was going to be painful for the first few years.
Right.
And as we approach the election, people are beginning to see dividends. And finally, Kenyans, when we go to the elections next year, you know, this has become, we must place a huge premium on meritocracy, because you can come up with the best budget, but if the people presiding over that budget are not meritocratic, they're not morals, they don't have morals, and they don't respect the Kenyan constitution, then as they say in my village, tutakuwa tukiosha kuku mguu.
Let's hear from you, Johnson.
No, for me, I think the underlying philosophy that came up with this budget needs to change. The focus ought to shift back to the value-creating sector, which is the private sector. That's where employment is happening, and more so in the MSME sector. If we're not going to address competitiveness, then job creation will suffer, and our people's welfare will continue to decline.
All right, Alexander.
Kenyans need to focus more on governance, because our greatest problem as a country is governance. And the government did request the IMF to conduct a governance and corruption diagnostic study. We are hoping that that report will be made public. And in the meantime, Kenyans can read the People's Audit that was released by Okoa Uchumi campaign that tries to look at what ails Kenya as a country from a fiscal point of view.
Thank you so much. Alexander Riithi, Head of Programs at the Institute for Social Accountability. Your wonderful thoughts have definitely helped us, myself included, to understand budget issues in the country and how the financial year has looked that we are currently in. And we also have Johnson Derry, an investment banker and finance expert. Thank you for making time. And Dismas Muku, as always, political and governance analyst. Thank you for making time. Gentlemen, nashukuru sana mmekuja to make sense for all of us and to help Kenyans understand why it's important to be involved and to voice their opinions, their views, their needs to the government. And we hope that the government will actually listen.
And you remember participation. So every Kenyan must engage in public participation.
Thank you, Dismas. Well, my name is Leangare, and my sign language interpreter earlier on was Wilson Mushora. As always, it's a pleasure to have you join us, and have a good night, and God bless you.